Hi folks, Josh Knight the First here with another episode of Rider Rewind, coming to you with episode 14 of the series. Let's get right into it. So this week on Kamen Rider Geo, we're getting to the end of the Ghost arc, but starting what appears to be the Decade arc. Now, I was interested in this crossover, seeing as it's two properties, as I was talking about last week, one I really like and one not so much, but Ghost is actually doing a lot better here in retrospect, the way they're fitting it into the story. The Decade portion is starting to worry me for different reasons, but we should go ahead and catch up with last week's episode, seeing as Sougo is kind of half dead. Now, one thing I do appreciate at the start of this episode is that we clarify just exactly how Takadu is able to do the things he's done without having died, but we'll get into that a little bit more later on in the episode. So we see that he does, in fact, have in his possession the Ghost Ride Watch, and that's what's allowing him to both see ghosts and also have this mystic power that he's shown off from last episode, which actually is getting played to quite great effect in this week's episode. Now, once Sougo is able to deduce that Takadu was the original rider and that's why he has the watch, he's able to make a plan off that. Now, based off this plan, it's kind of going back on the same thing he was getting scolded for several episodes ago about being just like the Time Jackers, in that going back in time could really mess up the time stream. But it doesn't seem to really matter this week because people keep going back to 2015. Now, the first person to do that is Gates. Now, Gates does have his copy of the Ghost Ride Watch, so he technically should be able to do this. The problem is he's not just facing off against another ghost, he's facing off against Decade in ghost form. So this is actually the debut of him using a rider power past his own series. And it appears it doesn't take long with knowing Gates to be able to use Gates' anger against him, because that's exactly what Tsukasa does to go ahead and hit him with a devised attack, and not only that, but hit him with a double rider kick with both him and another ghost. And this is enough to go ahead and take Gates out of the fight. Not only that, it cost him the Ride Watch. Now, they do get around this later on in the episode, but for right now, I think that's kind of a bummer thing that we're able to see that the Ride Watch powers can be taken away so easily. Now, is it because just Decade's that powerful, or he's working with the Time Jackers? We're not exactly certain, but we do know that Decade is at least really playing up this role of villain, at least for the sake of convincing the Time Jackers that he's on their side. But of course, we know Decade is also a hero, so he needs to go ahead and get that in here somehow. So instead of just giving him a broken Ride Watch back, he gives Gates a copy of his Ride Watch, the Decade Ride Watch, which will come into play later in the episode. Now, while that's going on in 2015, over on the other side of town with the inciting incidents that gave birth to another ghost, we see that Sougo's having his plan take effect. So we see that his idea was to go ahead and have Takadu pilot the Time Majin, go back to 2015 to when all of this started, and make sure it doesn't happen, which actually is the best thing they could have done. So the basic idea is that we need to make sure that Mika's brother isn't as much of a threat as he was before. As we saw in last week's episode, if he's dead, that kind of puts a bummer on everybody's plans. So the idea here is to make sure that Takadu can avert that crisis, make sure the beams don't fall on anybody, that way Mika's brother is still alive, essentially taking that threat away from the Time Jackers. Now, of course, that's going to help out for the rest of the episode, but really the thing that I like here is the parts of the episodes here in Geo where the past writer actually gets to use their powers again. So we see here that when things kind of revert back to the normal timeline, Makoto shows up, who's actually the secondary writer from that series, and we have a nice little fight there between Ghost Inspector versus the ghost villains of that series, the Ganma. Now, unfortunately, that victory is short-lived because Ur still reactivates the Ghost Ride Watch and puts it back in Mika's brother, meaning that the timeline has shifted back to the way it was at the beginning of the episode. But that important thing has still taken effect. Mika's brother is no longer dead. So it's nice that we got that little nugget there from the original Ghost series, that we basically got a fight that looked just the way it did in 2015. But another thing that I actually did like about Ghost series were the side characters, namely the female main character, which was Akari. Now, one of the things I liked about her character was that she wasn't like other writer heroines in that they focused more on her capability. She actually really helped out with the plot, and they're not so much focusing on her looks so much as her intelligence. One of the inventions she came up with there in the original series was this device that allowed her and everybody around her who wasn't Takadu to be able to see ghosts. This device actually makes an appearance here and is why everybody in 2018 can see Sougo in ghost form. Now, an interesting thing that I'm seeing here that's kind of got me confused is the fact that Takadu can seem to somehow relate to Sougo's experience while he's there in ghost form. Like we talked about in last week's episode, we're presuming that this Takadu, because the timeline has been messed with, hasn't had the chance to die, much less die 5 times. But here he's able to talk to Sougo about, hey, I know what that's like to not be really hungry, or at the end of the episode, talking about what it's like to really want food again. He's either, one, responding to just being hungry in general, yeah, people experience that, or two, that's just what I went through when I was dead. but did he die? They never quite addressed that. But of course, once that's gotten out of the way, we need to get back to the action in this episode, and there is a lot of it. So the one thing we get treated to here in the middle of the episode is the fight between the two sets of Time Majin, one from the Riders and the other from the Time Jackers. Now, I've said this before about the fights with the Time Majins. Even though they're entirely CG, I do appreciate the mocapping that's done for them. They're actually moving a lot like humans, but at the same time, I'm not quite sure why they're using the powers that they are. Granted, it was nice when they used the Exade powers for the Riders, and Genmu actually used the warp hole that he has from that series, but when they used the build powers, I don't really see what the advantage was. Granted, yes, they do a double rider kick in machine form, but really, they could have done that with any of the watches. Now, once we go back again to 2015, now it's time for the final showdown between Another Ghost and Gates and Geo. Now, Geo has this ride watch that's been given to him by Decade, subvertedly through Gates, and now we're going to get used to this new form for him, which is kind of a really strong power-up, or at least it's being billed that way, which is the Decade Ride Armor. Now, aesthetically speaking, this Decade Ride Armor actually looks the most like the Rider power that it's mimicking. Sougo does look like Decade now, and the face is actually made up to look like the K-Touch, which is the device that Decade used to achieve his final form. And speaking of final forms, we're going to see something attributing to that with the addition of this new weapon, the Hey Saber. Now, as far as puns go, that's a good pun. Hey Say, Hey Saber, yeah, it fits together. I like it. It's a pun, but fine. The use of it shows that it has the power of each rider, and you have to go backwards on the dial, backwards through time, to be able to access each of these riders' attacks. And really, it's just the sound and the look of it, and really it's not that much different, but somehow it's supposed to be stronger. Now again, tying back to Decade's original power, Decade had the power of being able to become other riders. So Sogo's going to be able to do that too here as Geo, but they're doing it a little bit differently. So what happens is there's an extra slot there on the Decade ride watch that allows for Sougo to use one of the other ride watches he's already collected. The thing is, it calls out final form time there on the belt, but those aren't final forms that he's accessing. First up, we see that he accesses, by use of the build ride watch, Build Rabbit Tank Sparkling, which isn't a final form, it's more like the first quarter power-up. It doesn't count as the final form at all. Same thing goes for the next form that he uses, which is Ghost Grateful form, but that wasn't a final form either. That was another first quarter power-up. So really, if we're supposed to be accurate here, the belt should be calling out first quarter rider attack time or something of that nature, but that doesn't sound as good, so they went with final form time, which is technically definitely a misnomer. But once the fight is over and everything's back to normal, Another Ghost is turned back into his normal self, we can go ahead and move on to next week's episode. But before we do that, Tsukasa has to make his presence known to Sougo and let him know if the world is destroyed, it's going to be by his hand, not by Omageo. And that very much fits into next week's episode when we see that Omageo will actually show up here in the series because Sogo's getting thrown into 2068, and we see that Tsukasa is in fact still around as Decade. So yeah, I really blew through the plot of the episode so I could get to the analysis portion, which I'll go ahead and start now. So there's a lot of things that I like and don't like about this episode, and I'm starting to say that more and more each week with each development in the story. But here the thing that's worrying me the most is the Decade portion. Now that Decade's here and he's going to seemingly be around for a while, it's really making me question why we even had to have a new writer when we've got Decade who's perfectly capable. Now granted, yes, the way that it works is the fact that he's playing up this villain role, but he can't do that forever. At the end of the day, Decade is a common writer. He's a good guy, one of the main character good guy writers, so that's going to show up eventually, and at that point, that's probably when we'll see him say bye, and we'll get the story back focused on Sougo. But until that happens, yeah, he's gonna steal a lot of the focus. Now to that end, I'm wondering how much the Time Jackers, or specifically Woz, actually knows about Decade, because they know enough to know that yes, he is the destroyer of worlds, but just how much is he going to affect the plot when they know that he was a good guy as far as history is concerned? But that's of course the Decade portion. Over on the Ghost end of things, I have to say this is probably one of the best episodes of Ghost that I've ever seen. Granted, that series left a lot to be desired in my mind, but for this episode, we see that Sougo actually relying on Takeru made sense. Takeru showed himself to be a better character. It was nice seeing Makoto show up. I wish we'd gotten to see Akari or Onari, two of the other side characters from Ghost, but we'll take what we've got here. They actually were a pretty good addition this week. Now, as to how things are going to pan out in next week's episode, we don't know yet. This could be the portion where things take off and we actually get to go in full speed into what the actual plot of the show is, not just dealing on, okay, new power, new power, new power, buy these toys. But hopefully we'll get that development next week, because yeah, it was nice to see all these Easter eggs this week, but it's not giving me enough story. But those, of course, are my thoughts on the episode. I want to hear what you guys thought in the comments below, so let's go ahead and talk about a few things. First off, Takeru. Based off everything that he was able to relate to Sougo throughout the episode, did he in fact die in this new timeline, and we just didn't see it on screen? Secondly, the Time Jackers. How long do you think it will take before they figure out that Tsukasa is actually working with the good guys throughout this whole series? And third, given that the End of Decade series left a lot to be desired and a lot of open-ended questions, do you think that the plot of Geo will actually shift to focus on some of Decade's mistakes so that they can correct them, or will the story still stay focused on Geo? You tell me in the comments below. And of course, during the week, you can always talk to me over on social media. On Twitter, I'm at JoshKnight1st. This has been episode 14 of Writer Rewind for episode 14 of Kamen Rider Geo, Go 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 Ghost 2015. I'm Josh Knight the First. I'll see you guys again next episode.